The neon sign of Rosie's Diner flickered against the damp pavement as heavy raindrops drummed on the roof. Inside, the warm scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the faint chatter of late-night customers. It was one of those nights where time seemed to stretch endlessly, the kind that made Claire Matthews, a seasoned waitress, question why she was still working double shifts to make ends meet. At 28, Claire had seen her fair share of tough days. Ever since her husband, Mike, had been injured in a construction accident, leaving him unable to work, she had taken up extra shifts to keep their small apartment in downtown Cincinnati. Bills stacked up faster than she could count, and medical expenses loomed over her like storm clouds. Still, she smiled at every customer, greeted every regular with warmth, and poured coffee like it was liquid gold. Tonight was especially draining. The rain had driven in a crowd of weary travelers and a handful of truckers, each ordering hot meals to escape the chill outside. Claire moved swiftly between booths, her feet aching in worn-out sneakers, as she refilled cups and balanced plates on her arm like a seasoned pro. The small television in the corner of the diner buzzed with news coverage of the latest political debates. Claire barely paid attention. Politics had long felt like a rich man's game, far removed from the struggles of people like her. But when the bell above the diner door jingled, she glanced up and did a double take. A tall man in a navy blue jacket walked in, shaking the rain off his sleeves. His face was unmistakable. The chiseled jaw, the piercing blue eyes, and the air of quiet confidence. JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, had just stepped into Rosie's Diner. The room fell into hushed whispers as a few customers turned to stare. Claire, gripping the coffee pot tightly, forced herself to remain calm. Sure, she had waited on celebrities before. Once, a country singer had stopped by after a concert. But a sitting vice president? That was another level entirely. Vance removed his jacket and slid into a booth by the window, his gaze scanning the laminated menu. He looked tired. Not the kind of exhaustion that came from travel, but something deeper, something Claire recognized. The weight of responsibility. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her notepad and approached his table. "Good evening, Mr. Vice President," she said with a practiced smile. "What can I get started for you?" He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was something surprisingly warm in them. "Just call me JD," he said, "and I'll take a cup of coffee. Black." Claire nodded, pouring the steaming liquid into the cup. "Anything else?" He hesitated, then gave a small grin. "I haven't had a good burger in a while. Let's go with that, extra pickles." "Coming right up." As she walked back to the kitchen, Claire overheard murmurs from a nearby table. A young couple whispered excitedly, while an older man in a trucker's cap muttered about politicians never setting foot in places like this. Claire blocked out the noise. To her, JD Vance wasn't the vice president in this moment. He was just another weary traveler needing a warm meal. But she had no idea that by the end of this night, a single note on his check would change everything. Claire busied herself behind the counter, stealing occasional glances at JD Vance as he sipped his coffee. He wasn't surrounded by Secret Service agents, at least not obviously. Maybe they were outside, watching from a black SUV with tinted windows. Or maybe, for once, he just wanted to be a regular guy in a small-town diner. She set his burger and fries on the plate, carefully adding the extra pickles as requested. As she approached his table, she felt a strange nervousness creep in. It wasn't every day that you served the vice president. "Here you go," she said, setting the plate down. "One all-American burger." JD chuckled. "Smells great. Thanks, Claire." She blinked in surprise. "You remembered my name?" He gestured toward her name tag. "I try to pay attention to the people serving me. They do more for this country than they get credit for." Claire didn't quite know how to respond to that. She had always felt invisible in jobs like this. Just another waitress with a pot of coffee and an aching back. But hearing the vice president acknowledge her work made something inside her soften. He took a bite of his burger, nodding in satisfaction. "This is better than anything I've had in DC." She smirked. "Well, that's because DC doesn't have Rosie's." JD chuckled, wiping his hands with a napkin. Fair enough. You've been working here long. Almost 6 years, she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Started part-time, but, well, life happened, and here I am. He tilted his head. What did you want to do before this? She hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone had asked her that. Before bills, before double shifts, before stress had piled onto her shoulders like bricks, she had dreams. I wanted to be a nurse, she admitted. Went to school for it, but couldn't afford to finish. JD's expression shifted, something thoughtful flickering in his eyes. That's tough. College costs are through the roof. She gave a short laugh. Tell me about it. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence. The diner hummed around them. Plates clinking, forks scraping against ceramic, the occasional burst of laughter from the counter. JD leaned back in his seat. You know, my mom worked as a waitress when I was a kid. Hardest working woman I ever knew. Claire raised an eyebrow. Really? He nodded. Back in Middletown, Ohio. She waited tables, trying to keep everything together. It wasn't easy. Claire had read about JD Vance's past. She remembered hearing about Hillbilly Elegy and how he had risen from poverty to where he was now. But sitting across from him, seeing the way his voice softened when he talked about his mother, made her realize that he wasn't just some polished politician. You turned out all right, she said with a small smile. He chuckled. Took a while. Had some good people believe in me. He sipped his coffee. And you? Got anyone in your corner? She thought of Mike, her husband, who had once been strong and full of life but now struggled to even walk some days. She thought of their son, Ethan, barely 6, too young to understand why mommy had to work late every night. My husband, she said quietly. He had an accident last year. Can't work anymore. So, it's just me keeping us afloat. JD set his cup down. That's a lot to carry. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. She had long ago learned not to dwell on self-pity. But something about the way JD Vance spoke, like he actually cared, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She quickly straightened up, forcing a smile. Well, it's nothing a good tip won't fix, she joked. He chuckled, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. Claire didn't know it yet, but before the night ended, that tip would be something she would never forget. Claire left JD Vance to enjoy his meal and busied herself with other customers. But her mind kept drifting back to their conversation. It wasn't often that someone took the time to ask about her, especially not someone as important as the Vice President of the United States. She wiped down the counter, half listening to the hum of conversation in the diner. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, and a few of the regulars were finishing up their meals. The older man in the trucker's cap who had muttered earlier about politicians now seemed to be sneaking glances at JD, his skepticism still evident. Claire knew how he felt. People in power always talked about understanding the struggles of the working class, but few actually did anything to change it. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She was too tired to think about politics. Her shift had been brutal, and she still had to get home, make sure Mike had taken his meds, and check if Ethan was asleep. She hated that she barely saw her son anymore. By the time she got home, he was usually curled up in bed, clutching his worn-out teddy bear. The weight of it all pressed down on her. She caught JD Vance watching her from his booth, his expression unreadable. Claire quickly turned away, grabbing a coffee pot to make herself look busy. She wasn't used to attention, especially not from someone like him. Hey, Claire. She turned back, surprised to see JD holding up an empty plate. That was one hell of a burger, he said with a grin. Compliments to the chef. She smirked. I'll pass it along to Gus. He'll appreciate it. JD hesitated before speaking again. What time do you get off? She blinked. In about 15 minutes. Why? He shrugged. Just figured it must be exhausting working this late. Do you have help at home? Claire hesitated, not sure why she was opening up to him. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way he spoke, like he genuinely cared. My sister watches Ethan when I work late, she admitted. But it's not easy. Mike, he's doing his best. But, she sighed, shaking her head. Some days, I feel like I'm drowning. JD studied her for a moment before nodding. I get it, he said simply. There was something about the way he said it, something that made her believe that he did understand. Before she could say anything else, the diner door swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He scanned the room, then nodded slightly toward JD. JD glanced at his watch. Looks like I'm out of time. He reached for the check Claire had left on his table, pulled out a pen, and scribbled something on it. Then, with one last nod, he stood, slipped on his jacket, and walked toward the door. The man in the suit followed him out, disappearing into the rainy night. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She walked over to his booth, picking up the check. She glanced at the total, $18.50. But her eyes widened when she saw the tip. And then she saw the note written beside it. Her hand flew to her mouth, and before she knew it, her vision blurred with tears. Claire's hands trembled as she held the check. Her tired eyes darted over the numbers again, making sure she wasn't imagining things. Tip $1,000. Her breath hitched. $1,000? That was nearly 2 weeks' worth of work for her. Her mind spun, trying to process what she was seeing. But it wasn't just the tip that made her burst into tears. It was the note scribbled in JD Vance's handwriting right next to it. For all the nights you've held it together, keep going. JD. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. The weight of exhaustion, stress, and quiet suffering she had carried for so long suddenly felt seen. $1,000 wouldn't change everything, but it meant groceries without counting every penny. It meant catching up on a medical bill. It meant a little bit of breathing room. She clutched the check to her chest, overwhelmed. Gus, the head cook, peeked out from the kitchen window. You good out there, Claire? She quickly wiped her face and forced a watery smile. Yeah, I'm fine. The trucker sitting at the counter caught sight of the tip over her shoulder and let out a low whistle. Damn. What did you do? Save his life. Claire let out a shaky laugh. No, I just served him a burger. She still couldn't believe it. Out of all the people JD Vance could have given such a generous tip to, he had chosen her. Not because she had asked for help, not because she had told a sob story, just because he had seen something in her that most people overlooked. A single moment of kindness had unraveled all the emotions she had been bottling up for years. She carefully folded the check and tucked it into her apron pocket. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to draw attention to herself. But as she finished closing out for the night, wiping down tables with slightly shaky hands, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Claire stepped into the chilly night air, pulling her thin jacket tightly around her. The rain had slowed to a mist, the pavement glistening under the streetlights. She still couldn't shake the surreal feeling of what had just happened. $1,000 tip. From the Vice President of the United States. She climbed into her rusted Toyota, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The check was still in her apron pocket, folded neatly, as if handling it too roughly would make it disappear. As she turned the key, the old car groaned before sputtering to life. The check engine light flickered, just another thing she had ignored for months. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she had the means to do something about it. Her drive home was quiet, the city lights reflecting in her tired eyes. She thought about what JD had written on the check. For all the nights you've held it together, keep going. How had he known? How had he seen the exhaustion, the quiet battle she fought every single day? She blinked away fresh tears. Maybe it wasn't about her, specifically. Maybe he had seen it in his mother. In every hard-working woman trying to hold a family together. Maybe he just knew the weight of survival. By the time she pulled up to her small apartment building, the lump in her throat had settled. She climbed the stairs, her body aching from the long shift. But for once, the exhaustion didn't feel so suffocating. She unlocked the door quietly, stepping inside to find the small living room dimly lit. On the couch, Her husband, Mike, stirred awake, his face drawn with pain. "Hey," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. "How was work?" She hesitated for a moment, then slowly pulled the check from her pocket and handed it to him. Mike squinted at it, his tired eyes adjusting to the dim light. When he saw the amount, his head snapped up. "Claire, what is this?" She smiled, her voice breaking. "JD Vance came into the diner tonight." Mike's brows furrowed in confusion. "The Vice President?" She nodded. "And he just gave you this?" Claire swallowed hard. "Yeah, I don't know why. I didn't ask for anything. I guess he saw something in me." Mike stared at the check for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. "You deserve this," he said softly. The dam broke. Claire let out a choked sob, burying her face into Mike's shoulder. He held her the best he could, his grip weak but warm. For once, the burden didn't feel like it was crushing her. For once, she didn't feel so alone. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that things could get better. The next morning, Claire woke up to the rare feeling of hope buzzing in her chest. The weight of worry was still there, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel insurmountable. She moved quietly through the small apartment, careful not to wake Mike or Ethan. The check from JD Vance sat on the kitchen counter, and every time her eyes landed on it, she felt a strange mix of disbelief and gratitude. $1,000. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind already racing with possibilities. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, and maybe, just maybe, she could finally take Mike to see a specialist about his condition. A soft shuffle of footsteps made her turn. Ethan stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his little eyes, his teddy bear clutched in his arms. "Mommy," he murmured sleepily. Claire set down her coffee and knelt to his level, opening her arms. He ran into them, snuggling close. "Morning, baby," she whispered into his soft hair. He pulled back, blinking up at her. "Are you sad today?" Her heart squeezed. Ethan had learned to read her exhaustion far too well for a 6-year-old. She cupped his little face in her hands, forcing a smile. "Not today, buddy." He studied her for a moment, then smiled back. "Good." As she ruffled his messy hair, Claire knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, she was going to fight for a better life. A few hours later, Claire sat at the kitchen table, the check still in front of her as she dialed her sister, Hannah. The phone rang twice before Hannah picked up, her voice groggy. "Claire? You okay?" Claire let out a small laugh. "Yeah, I actually have some good news for once." That woke Hannah up. "Good news? From you? Well, this I have to hear." Claire took a deep breath. JD Vance came into the diner last night, and he left me a $1,000 tip. There was silence on the other end. Then, "What?" Claire winced, pulling the phone slightly away from her ear. "Yeah, I couldn't believe it either. You're telling me the vice president walked into Rosie's, ate a burger and just what? Handed you $1,000? Claire bit her lip. "Pretty much." "Holy." "Claire, this is huge. What are you gonna do with it?" Claire exhaled slowly. "Pay some bills, stock up on groceries. But I was thinking, maybe I could use some of it to take Mike to see a specialist. Get a real diagnosis." There was a pause before Hannah spoke again, softer this time. "That's a good idea, Claire." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yeah, I think so too." They talked a little longer before hanging up. As Claire sat there, staring at the check, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the message JD Vance had left her. "For all the nights you've held it together, keep going." And she would. She would keep going. For Ethan. For Mike. For herself. Because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was hoping. The next few days passed in a blur. Claire deposited the check, feeling a strange sense of relief as she saw her account balance rise, if only for a little while. The stress of making ends meet wasn't gone, but it had loosened its grip on her, if only just enough for her to breathe. She paid off the overdue electric bill and stocked the fridge with enough groceries to last them weeks. But the most important thing she did was schedule an appointment with a specialist for Mike. It wasn't easy. The hospital was 2 hours away, and the appointment was expensive even with insurance. But for the first time in years, she could afford it. Mike had tried to protest at first. "Claire, we should use the money for Ethan," he had said, guilt evident in his voice. "He needs new shoes for school." "We'll take care of Ethan," she had interrupted gently. "But we need to take care of you too, Mike. We can't keep guessing about what's wrong." He had stared at her for a long moment before sighing. "I just don't want to be a burden." Her heart had cracked at that. She had reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not a burden, Mike. You're my husband." And that was that. Now, as they sat in the waiting room of the specialist's office, Claire tapped her foot anxiously against the floor. Mike sat beside her, looking pale but trying to put on a brave face. Ethan was with Hannah for the day, so for once, it was just the two of them. "Do you think they'll actually figure out what's wrong?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Claire turned to him, determination burning in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted, "but at least we're trying." A nurse called Mike's name, and he gave Claire a nervous glance before standing up. She gave him an encouraging nod. "I'll be right here," she promised. And as he walked into the exam room, Claire let out a shaky breath. For the first time in a long time, they were moving forward. And all because one man had seen her struggle and chosen to help. Claire sat in the waiting room, her fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every tick of the clock felt like an eternity. She had spent years watching Mike's health decline without knowing why. The fatigue, the weakness, the pain, doctors had dismissed it as stress or lingering effects of his old injury. But deep down, Claire had always known it was something more. And now, for the first time, they might actually get answers. After what felt like hours, the door finally opened. Mike stepped out, followed by the doctor, a middle-aged man with a kind but serious face. Claire stood up immediately, searching Mike's face for any clues. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "They think it's an autoimmune disorder. Something called myasthenia gravis." Claire's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" The doctor stepped forward, hands in his pockets. "It's a neuromuscular condition that affects communication between the nerves and muscles. That's why he's been experiencing weakness and fatigue." Claire's mind spun. She had spent years worrying, wondering, fighting through sleepless nights, and now they finally knew. "Is it treatable?" she asked, her voice tight. The doctor nodded. "It's manageable. With medication and lifestyle changes, many patients see a significant improvement in their quality of life." Relief crashed over Claire like a wave. She turned to Mike, whose eyes were slightly glassy, like he was still trying to process it all. For years, he had been suffering in silence, afraid that nothing could be done. Now, for the first time, there was hope. Claire reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "We can do this," she whispered. Mike swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, we can." As they scheduled follow-ups and discussed treatment options, Claire felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting, and she wasn't fighting alone. The drive home from the hospital was quiet. Mike stared out the window, deep in thought, while Claire kept glancing at him, searching for any sign of how he was feeling. Finally, as they reached their apartment, he let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted, his voice low. "I'm relieved we have answers, but I'm scared, Claire." She parked the car and turned to him, taking his hand in hers. "Me too," she whispered. "But we're not alone in this." Mike nodded slowly, squeezing her fingers. "Yeah, we're not." That night, after tucking Ethan into bed, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She had thought about it all day, about JD Vance, about his note, about how one simple act of kindness had changed everything for her family. And now she wanted to thank him. Taking a deep breath, she put pen to paper. "Dear Mr. Vice President, You probably don't remember me, but a few nights ago, you came into Rosie's diner and left a generous tip with a note that said, "For all the nights you've held it together, keep going." I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted you to know what that note and that tip did for me. I've spent years barely keeping my head above water, working late nights, trying to support my husband and son, wondering how much longer I could keep going. I was tired, exhausted, and for the longest time I felt invisible. But you saw me. Your kindness didn't just help pay the bills or put food on the table. It gave me the push I needed to fight for my husband's health. Because of you, we were able to see a specialist and finally get a diagnosis. We have a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I believe we're going to be okay. You reminded me that there are people in the world who care. You reminded me that I'm not alone. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Sincerely, Claire Miller. Claire wiped away a stray tear as she folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. She didn't know if it would ever reach him, but she hoped, somehow, that he would know what his kindness had meant to her. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. No matter what happened next, she knew one thing for sure. She would keep going. Because now, she finally believed that better days were ahead. A week passed since Claire had mailed the letter. Life slowly began to shift in a way she never thought possible. Mike had started his treatment, and while it wasn't an overnight fix, the doctors were hopeful. For the first time in years, he wasn't just pushing through, he was getting help. Ethan, sensing the change in the house, had been more cheerful than ever. He no longer woke up to hushed conversations about overdue bills or the fear of losing their home. He had even drawn a picture for his parents, a stick-figure family, smiling under a bright sun. And Claire? She was still working at Rosie's, still serving plates of burgers and coffee to weary travelers and regulars alike. But now she stood a little taller. The weight on her shoulders, while still there, didn't feel quite so crushing anymore. Then, one quiet afternoon, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Claire turned from the counter, a practiced smile on her face, only for it to falter slightly. Standing at the entrance was a tall man in a dark suit, flanked by two others. The Vice President of the United States had just walked into Rosie's again. Her heart pounded as JD Vance scanned the diner, his eyes landing on her. A slow, familiar smile crossed his face as he walked toward the counter. "Miss Miller," he greeted warmly, resting his hands on the counter. "It's good to see you again." Claire struggled to find words. "Mr. Vice President." He held up a hand. "First of all, call me JD. His gaze softened. "Second, I believe you sent me a letter?" Claire felt her breath hitch. He had read it. "I did," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted you to know what your kindness did for my family." JD nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Your letter reminded me why small acts of kindness matter. Too often, we get caught up in the big picture and forget that real change starts at a personal level." Claire swallowed hard. "You changed our lives, JD. I don't know how to thank you." "You already did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "But I came here to do something in return." He unfolded the paper and slid it across the counter. Claire's eyes widened as she realized what she was looking at. It was a check for $25,000. Her knees nearly gave out. I can't." JD smiled. "You can. And you will. This isn't charity, Claire. This is an investment. In you. In your family. In your future." Tears welled in her eyes as she covered her mouth with her hand. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. JD leaned forward slightly. "Say that you'll use it to keep moving forward. To give your husband the care he needs. To build a better future for Ethan." Claire nodded rapidly, tears now streaming down her face. "I will. I promise." JD gave her a knowing smile and tapped the counter twice. "Then that's all I need to hear." He turned to leave, but then paused. "Oh, and one more thing." Claire blinked up at him. JD grinned. "Next time I'm here, I expect my coffee on the house." A choked laugh escaped Claire as she wiped at her tears. "You've got it." With that, JD Vance and his security team exited the diner, leaving Claire standing in stunned silence. She looked down at the check in her hands, her heart pounding. Everything had changed, and it had all started with a note on a check. Claire took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she held the future in her fingertips. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living, and she couldn't wait to see what came next.